just a word of introduction about myself. My name's Margot James. I was a business minister and also digital minister when in government, and I'm now chair of the Warwick Manufacturing Group, which is part of the University of Warwick. And I've learned an awful lot about clusters by being in one. There is just to tell you a little bit about one of the clusters that we're in at Warwick. It is all about the decarbonisation of transport. And some of that has its roots in history, in the fact that the automotive sector is the strongest part of the country, is Coventry, Warwickshire and the wider Midlands region. So that has given oomph to other investment opportunities that have come in on the back of the need to reach the 2030 target of no more new internal combustion engines being sold. And so what we built on and we continue to reinforce is the skills, the supply chain, and it's a mix really of public funding. There's no doubt the government has been a real good catalyst in this area by investing in the R&D behind electrification with the establishment of an institute called the Faraday, which is run out of Oxford, and the government's £100 million investment in the UK Battery Industrialisation Centre, which is a few miles from the university, and WMG put proposals together for that. And that has collectively incentivised a lot of investment from the private sector. We already had JLR in a big supply chain, huge supply chain in the Midlands, but since we have formalised this cluster around the decarbonisation of the transport sector, we've attracted investment like Lotus Cars have put their technology electrification centre on our campus, British Volt, the new battery manufacturer, and numerous other companies have invested in the region on the back of this. So it's, I think, a mixture of history, serendipity, crucial role of both government nationally and also a very supportive local authority, two local authorities, and the excellent mayor in Andy Street and the West Midlands Combined Authority. And it's all a combination of the removal of obstacles, tax incentives, some seed finance from government, and it always prompts the argument of whether government investment in these areas, the new investment zones, cannibalises and is just moving investment around. Having experienced life in the cluster, I don't agree with that. I think if it's properly done, and we're hearing from experts about how it will be properly done, the growth is exponential compared to a similar investment somewhere where that cluster isn't energising the whole, where the whole isn't greater than the sum of its parts. So our first speaker, George Freeman, probably the best qualified member of the Conservative Party in Parliament to talk on this subject, having been both Minister for Life Sciences and also, most recently, a highly effective Minister for Science, Technology and Innovation. And we are very grateful to George for citing one of his innovation accelerators bang on our doorstep in Warwickshire and the West Midlands. That's part of 3 around the country. One of the many things that George did in government towards the goal of making Britain a science and technology superpower by 2030. So George, over to you.
Margaret, thank you. And it's great to see you as a very distinguished former colleague, great minister, still at it and bringing your energy and leadership to it, to this agenda. And thank you to Onward for convening us. Look, lots of familiar faces in the room. Let me just set the context, and then I'm going to be quite provocative because I'm out of government and I'm still a member of Parliament and I still care, so I'm allowed to be provocative. Look, I think it's, first point, it is easy to take the last 2 or 3 weeks, the last few months, and panic and think, oh my God, this is a complete economic U-turn on everything. I welcome the little U-turn yesterday on the 45p rate, but to think this is a complete rejection of everything we've done in the last 12 years, everything that we've done as a coalition and through the years, the early work we did on the life sciences, launching the industrial strategy for agri-tech, for life science, for the aerospace sector and all of those under David Willits, and then the work we did on places under Theresa May, and then the work we've been doing in the last few years around levelling up and supporting regional innovation clusters. I hope that isn't the case. I don't think we should conclude it is. I'm a bit worried that we haven't had a science minister until last night. Nuzgani is first class. I worked with her when I was Minister of State for the Future of Transport, and she's incredibly assiduous, smart, hardworking, and gets it. But I think we should assume that the programme that the government was elected on in 2019, I still think an inspiring programme of tackling the structural weakness of our economy, and over southeast focus, over service economy focus, over cheap labour dependent economic model that just drives cycles of boom and bust and frustration, that we're going to tackle it and we're going to drive a much more productive, innovative, R&D leveraging economy that is much more competitive, attracts inward investment, and becomes a bigger player in the world in terms of generating the solutions to the big global challenges we face. It was inspiring then. I still think it's inspiring. We won a huge majority on it. Despite Boris's foibles and weaknesses, it is still, I think, what the British public want. They're fed up with us being a sort of globalisation scrap heap of a service economy. Fine for those who provide services, not very much fun if you're working in it. They want something more inspiring. And I think that's what the Brexit vote was really a vote for. So I hope that that agenda and that crusade continues. But I think if you bump into any ministers, just check. And I think we all need to keep making the point. Never has it been more urgent. If you look at our debt to GDP ratio, you look at the global insecurity, you look at the supply chain tensions, you look at things we've taken for granted, endless supply of silicon chips out of Taiwan. Not necessarily if China's putting aircraft carriers and if there's tension there, the Ukraine war. We've realised quite a lot of the things we need, from critical minerals to semiconductors, we better start making some more of them, just in terms of economic resilience. So we're in a very different landscape. And I want to just start by saying, if you want growth, and boy do I want growth, I've written about growth for 12 years, I invested in growth for 15 years, we're all here, I think, because we get growth. There's a big difference between growth that drives productivity, that drives opportunity, that drives regeneration, that drives hope and political engagement around the country, that strengthens the union, that strengthens left behind regions, the innovation-led model of growth, and the trickle-down model of southeast overheat, cheap labour service economy growth, which is the model of growth we rejected. And so I hope that the government, in saying we're going for growth, is going for the right sort of growth. I mean, we need all sorts of growth, but we definitely have to keep the focus on the right sort of innovation-led growth. And the reason I'm at this event is that I think Onward have rightly highlighted that this is an agenda that needs real leadership, and I intend out of government to continue to bang the drum for it. Right, 3 provocative points. The question is, how can science clusters generate prosperity? How do we do it? Firstly, I want to insist it's not just science. It's science, research, technology, and innovation. They're all different. It's the innovation that's key, really, often underpinned by science, but the conversation can be captured by science. It's a problem because in politics, people say, no one cares about science. You can cut the budgets. They do care about growth. They do care about innovation. So I just continue to talk about science, tech, and innovation economy. 3 big things. Firstly, to map these clusters. I mean, the Golden Triangle in Shanghai, Singapore, San Diego, people get Oxford, Cambridge, London. They can see it from space. But we need to tell ourselves and them that there are others in this emerging forest of innovation, from the South Coast Marine Technology Corridor to the South Wales Compound Semiconductor Corridor to the North Wales Nuclear Cluster to the Newquay Spaceport to the Norwich Agri-Tech Centre to the Warwick Robotics. I mean, you can go on, right? There's about 30, as it happens. And I was leading a piece of work to map them. We should map them. They're not round, square, or triangular. They don't fit in county council boundaries, but they're real, and they're growing. And just identifying them all, colour-coding them, and highlighting to the world what they are really world-class at would be a really important start. And undermining the Golden Triangle in the South East is not the right way to strengthen them. But that's a research triangle, really. What the real opportunity is to grow out the manufacturing, the advanced manufacturing, the packaging, the smart, all of that broader D in the R&D economy, and grow those clusters all around the country. So that's my first point. Secondly, skills. When you go to these clusters, I went back to the Northeast first meeting last year, first visit as a new minister, because it was an area that I'd done a lot of work on regeneration. Incredible what's going on up there. I met Chromek, fastest growing technology company in the UK, actually, in that field. And the technical director of Chromek, I said, what was your career? Thinking he'd say Stanford, Harvard, Cambridge, Birmingham. He said, well, I did a HND up in Northumbria, then I got headhunted by Chromek, and then I went back and did. He's totally northeast, born, bred, educated, trained, in the northeast, leading the new northeast industrial revolution. That is incredibly exciting. But a lot of people don't realise what's going on. A lot of people don't realise what's coming. So I would, on skills, we should map the jobs that have been created. Hundreds of thousands of exciting jobs. Most teachers don't know about it. Most school leavers and college students don't know about it. I'd allow companies to pull their apprenticeship levy and create more of the institutes that this area has pioneered. If you want to do tax cuts, I'd take the 6% compound interest off student loans. That's a tax on aspiration and education. I'd take out the CGT, I'd put back CGT relief and go to zero CGT for people who put their own money at risk to grow innovation companies over 10 years. I'd put some CGT relief into people who do scale-ups. You want tax cuts that drive growth and innovation, we could really do something exciting and give the young an opportunity to be excited by this country's future. The biggest problem in this country is most of the young are pretty depressed. That is a terrible thing for a country's future. And then lastly, investment. I would allow proven clusters like the West Midlands, like Greater Manchester. I mean, you could start. We started with 3 innovation accelerators that I set up with Michael Gove. We wanted 33. Take the top 5 or 10. I'd give them radical powers to set up cluster development corporations, allow them to raise money privately. There is billions of money around the world. If you said to them, would you like to take a 10% stake in the West Midlands Development Corporation? What does that entitle me to? Well, it has powers, compulsory purchase for public sector land, tax increment financing, land value capture gain. It can drive regeneration and innovation, build science parks, cycle paths. You could finance it in weeks. It doesn't need Treasury money. So all power to Kwasi, shaking up the Treasury orthodoxy. Boy, does it need it. And let's give radical powers to clusters around the country. They'll need leaders. If they've got good mayors, great. Or they can be business leaders who take it on as a chair. I'd love to do it in East Anglia. We could raise billions. We could take the 52 railway stations and develop them into small business units. We could do something really bold in the spirit of radical Joe Chamberlain. That's the growth I think we need, and the tax cuts need to drive that agenda.
Thank you very much, George. That was a really inspiring start to our session. I'm going to save questions for the Q&A after all the speakers have spoken. Next up is Dr. Ben Martin. Ben is Cluster Development Manager at the Northern Health Science Alliance Limited, and in that role, Ben is working with industry, the private sector, clinicians, academia, and government. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Margaret. And so as the Cluster Development Manager at a cluster development organisation, I think that last point was extremely exciting for me personally. I think we've seen a lot of momentum going in a really good direction. I really like your point about we need the right sort of growth. I think it's really important that carries on in this government. We need to see that the regions outside of the southeast have their strengths, they have their developing clusters, they have some clusters that are already well developed and recognised on an international stage, and by investing in them and supporting in them we can see the regions growing and driving, using innovation to drive growth rather than relying on just growing London ever bigger, overheating the housing market and just trying to cram all the jobs in one part of the country. So I'm going to talk a little bit actually more on the sort of at the practical level, I guess, of my role of trying to grow clusters and what that really entails, rather than the very high policy level. But I think I wanted to start with making the point that I obviously coming from this from a health and life science cluster point of view, and not all science. And I think part of the reason that I'm particularly passionate about health and life science innovation is that we get a double benefit because we drive growth through innovation, but we also improve the health of our population as well. And so we've run various programs over the years. Our 2018 Health Wealth report found that a third of the productivity gap in the north of England was due to ill health of the population. We know that every pound spent on R&D in medical research gives a 25p return every year forever because of the return to GDP, but also the improved health of the population. And we also know that NHS trusts that do a lot of R&D, their local populations have higher life expectancy and a higher healthy life expectancy. So that's why I'm very passionate about trying to drive innovation in health and life sciences. And finally, we actually genuinely are one of the best countries in the world for health and life sciences, and we have a huge strength to build on. So what do I do in my role? I try to bring together these 24 organisations and look at what their strengths are collectively, bring together the key leaders in different areas from those organisations, but also from industry, from local government, from national government, and ask them, what are the challenges to growth? What are the opportunities? How can we synthesise them together and pull around that and really drive things forward? As George said really nicely as well, those clusters don't fit into county council lines, and often having somebody just bridge that gap is really, really vital, and it's a relatively sometimes straightforward thing to do, but it's a very key component of bringing together the access to the capital, the local government, the industry base, the clinical base, the research base, and bringing it all together to actually drive things forward. So the two quick examples that I'm going to give for that are, we have recently just launched a program with the Israeli version of Innovate UK, where they are putting money into cutting edge companies to come and do their R&D in the north of England, develop their technologies here, get a better market fit with the NHS, have a better understanding of our clinical pathways, how to actually help our patients with it, but also to spend their R&D money here and open offices and create jobs and so on. And so I'm really excited by this program that we've just launched. And the only way that would have happened, or only way it did happen, was because we could bring together the whole of the North, all of these organisations as one collective identity to engage with. And they would never have done this on an individual hospital by hospital basis. The Golden Triangle may well have been able to pull it off, but we managed to do it by bringing together these organisations and acting as a cluster. And then the second point I want to talk about very quickly is on a more micro level, cluster development organisations are vital in seeding the connections on a personal level, because organisations don't collaborate with each other, people collaborate with each other. And so we work with a sister organisation very similar to ours called MedCity in London. In March of this year, we worked with them to bring venture capitalists and angel investors from the south up to the north, brought them to Leeds. We spent the day showing them what our innovation programs are doing, and crucially made those connections between the people who are running innovation programs and the investors, so that then that network is then brought outside of just the southeast. And we are running that event again, bigger and better, in partnership with Midlands Innovation Health and Mid-City and Harani as well, bringing in the Northern Ireland aspect. So I think cluster development organisations and having people that can look across the artificial boundaries that we sometimes have around county councils is a really key part of driving the growth. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Ben. Next up, we have Professor Mike Lewis, Professor of Life Science Innovation at the University of Birmingham, and also Joint Director of the National Institute for Health and Care Research and some joint programmes. And Mike also chairs 3 life sciences companies and has a great expertise in the area of private equity. So a really interesting background, Mike. Over to you.
I hate going after George because half the things he says are already on my script here. He's just read them out. He must be the most long-sighted person I know to be able to read from that distance. Firstly, as a professor from the University of Birmingham, my alma mater, welcome to the largest public building in Europe. This cost us 188 million, this library, and I think we can definitely say it's not a dump. Thanks. I was on Twitter this morning, and the very first advert that came up, it said, do you want to know more about bubblegum flavoured vodka? What? Probably tells you more about me than it tells you about you. But I just thought, why? Why has somebody spent a whole career in chemistry and science just to come up with something like bubblegum flavoured vodka? And I thought, thank goodness I chose a career in healthcare and life sciences, where you actually can do some good, you can be valued, you can do something valuable, you can do something socially and something economically good. It's a place where you can make a difference. So I'm really happy that I'm sort of bringing a life science feel, not just a science feel. Probably what I know about quantum physics you could write on the head of a quark. As some of the other panelists have said as well, about 1% of the UK workforce works in life sciences. We generate about 80 billion of revenue per year. The average wages for a person working in life science are 20% higher than the average wage. A job in life sciences and science is a good job, it's a valuable job, and it's also a well-tenured job because people don't cycle through them. It's not like working in a restaurant or something. These are good jobs. We're a net exporter of pharma products. We're a net importer of medical devices. In fact, I suppose we could use a vernacular here, say there's a lot of pie we could grow here, if you've been in conference. Challenge for us is we are, as George mentioned, we're very southeast centric. 67% of biopharma workers work in the southeast, 40% of medtech workers work in the southeast. They work in the overheated, overwaged, underproductive, high rent, low space, barrier to inward investment locale, which is the southeast golden triangle. And it's good, but we really need to blow those clusters outside. Nobody voted for me, so I can say what I want, really. The last time I was voted for was as head boy. I didn't win, so we're okay. If you think about it, though, think about the southeast. I went through the list of MPs. 85 Conservative MPs are from the Oxbridge area, and that's where they were educated. Maybe a little bit of confirmation bias creeping in here for the psychologists amongst you. But I think one of the things we have to overcome is if we're going to grow these clusters, we have to think beyond the southeast. We have to think about the areas where good science is taking place. The other road we face as well is that there aren't many people in any major party that get science like George does. Okay? There are very few people, less than 3% of MPs studied a science at university. How are you going to grow a science and technology business if the people leading policy don't get science and don't understand it? One outlier is probably Therese Coffey, my ultimate boss's boss. Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. She is a postgrad in chemistry, but she is an outlier. If you look at her, her opposite number, Wes Streeting, he qualified in what? History?
PPE?
History. If you look at Jonathan Reynolds, Shadow Business Secretary, he qualified in? Anybody?
Economics.
History. If you look at Jacob Rees-Mogg, Business Secretary, qualified in? History, absolutely right. Do you see a little pattern here? So we've got a problem here with clusters. We've got a geographic problem. We've also got to educate the people in policy. It sort of begs the question, do we have the raw talent in this country to do science well? I think the biggest science innovations I can think of talking to students is probably clean water, vaccines, antibiotics, and imaging. Edward Jenner, vaccines. John Snow discovered the link between cholera and clean water. Fleming, penicillin. Francis Crick, part of the trio, Crick, Watson, and Franklin, who discovered the structure of DNA. Notice I threw that last one in there. Our universities, because I work in one, we turn out great graduates. We turn out great postgraduates as well. If you look at the research stats, we do more research and we have more citations in publications for research than even the US. Our research is that good, but we don't take that through to innovation. In the NIHR, National Institute of Health Research, where I work, we have over 1 million people today, I checked it, 1 million people today on clinical trials of new therapies and new medicines. We have 5,500 clinical trials running today looking at new therapies. So we have a great research base. But then you think, does that research only happen in the southeast? Do you remember those names I just quoted you? Edward Jenner, Gloucestershire boy. John Snow, from York. Alexander Fleming, a Scot. Okay, Francis Crick, another Northamptonshire boy. Even if you start thinking about some of the more modern people, let's talk about Adrian Hill from AstraZeneca vaccine fame. He was a Dubliner. If you talk about Dame Sarah Gilbert, she was a Northamptonshire girl. She was educated at UAE and went on to Hull. Science happens outside. Good science happens outside the southeast. So we've got a challenge. If we're going to grow clusters, we have to educate people on the geography and the science, and we have to make them understand that the dreaming spies may be good for some research, but for science research, it can happen anywhere and everywhere, and we have to encourage it. We talk about clusters and concentrating science, but we have to, I'm going to steal Therese Coffey again with her ABCDD, her message. What we have to do, we have to be ambitious, we have to be bold, we have to be consistent, we need leadership which is dedicated, there's my D, and we have to have a driven approach to driving it. I'm glad we've now got a Minister for Science to replace George. I'm disappointed it's not a cabinet level minister, because sound doesn't exist in a vacuum, and science won't exist really if you've got a vacuum talking about it. It needs to be right at the top table. We need to do some of the things that George mentioned, inward investment into the UK. You can't just direct it to Oxbridge all the time, because the advising community is from Oxbridge, and that's where they live and that's where they work. You have to think wider than that. And to quote Norman Tebbit, if anybody remembers him, the DIT needs to get on their bike and find out there's other places outside. Local mayors, I was talking to Andy Street downstairs, local mayors need more power to invest to clear areas, to decide planning rules, to make the space and the investments to drive what they can see locally, because only they can decide what's good for the local investment. I work with Midlands Innovation Health. I work with the guys at Bruntwood, talk to the people at MedCity as well. They need help, they need tax incentives to invest in building at risk, because a lot of the time we build stuff, it comes out and then there's no space for people to grow into. They need tax incentives to drive that. Public science, where I work, has to be nudged firmly to go towards more research outside the Golden Triangle. If you want to do diabetes research, you don't do it in Cheltenham, you do it in Leicester. If you want to do health inequalities research, you don't do it in monochrome Cambridge, you do it where the people are. So we've got to push the research out. More support for science parks, and the universities as well. I'm going to take a hit on the back for this one. We need to get better at doing spin-outs, because we have this cookie-cutter model where we spend 6 months discussing what the equity split should be between the founders and the university, and going through multiple contracts and discussions. We just need to get really smart and fast. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much, Mike. Plenty of room for some questions, I think, from the great presentation you gave us. Thank you. And finally, Rain Newton-Smith, Chief Economist at the CBI. And Rain has a particular expertise in the transition to a low-carbon future. And I gather you also lead on economics and tax policy. So maybe there'll be a couple of questions for you on that as well.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be. And I think that what we have learned in the past couple of weeks is that economic stability and strength of institutions is a sort of bedrock, I think, for any plan for growth and innovation. Look, I think speaking for at CBI, we represent 190,000 businesses, including many world-leading universities here around the UK. Across regions, across sectors, across size of business, and I think what we do know is that innovation, science, and clusters, is really at the heart of what we all want to do. And I think, if I've heard from businesses, I think one of the things they say that we really need to ensure is that we keep some of the commitments we've had from government. We've worked very hard, and George and I were just sort of discussing this, the R&D roadmap, that commitment to ensuring that we have 2.4% of spending on R&D as a share of GDP, that we keep that roadmap in place. Because the businesses I talk to is, what kind of exasperates them is when we have these long-term frameworks and then they get ripped up as we see a change in government or leadership. So I think it's really important that we don't row back on that. That is just, the sort of tram lines that we need to get the long-term predictability and certainty, to get investment and innovation going in the UK. I mean, 2/3 of businesses say it is that long-term certainty that really helps them to drive innovation. I think the second point is just, that sort of role of public-private partnership in really driving some of the clusters and I think we're so lucky in the UK, right, that we've got world-leading universities in all regions of the UK. Other countries, aren't as fortunate to have that dispersion, but I think to what some, we don't always back them in the same way, and whether it's looking at, some of the developments around the cluster in net zero in around Teesside and the Humber, and what they're doing around carbon capture, usage and storage, the development of offshore wind, and bringing together manufacturers with renewable energy. I mean, it really is world leading, and we need to get behind it. And those, similar innovations. I was recently at the Port of Milford Haven in Wales, and looking at the development around, and this is matching fundamental physics research around green hydrogen and how you develop that, and then bringing it together with how you can decarbonize steel in Port Talbot, but also around shipping. And I think it's these, this is high risk technology, but it has high reward in terms of making that net zero transition. And I think we do have to get, we really have to back this. And I have the good fortune to be part of some, to at least get a bit of an insight to some of the amazing research that's been doing on at the University of Birmingham. And you're too modest, so I can say some of it. But what I saw around graphene and fundamental physics, and I'm not going to pretend I know more about that, but from what it just was amazing. And obviously the development of the hydrogen trains to what's happening around rare diseases and that clinical, and often these work not just through the University of Birmingham, it's the partnership with other universities and hospitals and practicing hospitals, right? And how that works at a community level, right, is really where there's sort of power in understanding the research and what the innovations can come about at that. And and look, we, I think we have to be really proud in the UK of how we helped to develop one of the world leading vaccines that literally, saved all of us in the COVID pandemic. So I think if you can see the art of the power of the possible of what we can do when we get the public-private partnership right, it's just amazing what we can do. And so then it comes to policy. How do we deliver that? And I think, as I said, we need to have that commitment to the overall roadmap. I think we are definitely still, if we're serious about getting growth and getting to 2.5% growth target, innovation has to be at the heart of that. And if we're thinking about the spend on that, that is one area where you can really show that this is not an area where public spending crowds out private spending. It really helps to crowd it in, and you can see that from all the research that's been done. And I think what we need to see is, cross departmental approach to this. We need innovation to be at the heart of all government departments, and a body that's really in charge of accelerating that across government departments. I think the tax landscape absolutely plays a role, and one of the reasons why the UK has been successful is we have, the R&D tax credit is world leading. It's recognised as being value for money in terms of its impact, and so I think we need to build on that and make sure it covers things like data processing, clinical trials, and some of the more, some of the latest developments, I think, in R&D. And finally, absolutely agree with what others have saying around that sort of flexibility in the levy and the role of skills in delivering innovation. I think, and if there's a chance to sort of think again about government policy and some of the sacred cows, the apprenticeship levy hasn't achieved the aims that anyone wanted it to deliver. Apprenticeships have gone down, and I think now is the time to think again about a modern approach to training that works for people and modern lifestyles, which isn't necessarily just going off-site one day a week, but also is really helping businesses and companies understand their sustainability footprint. There's so much in terms of skills that we need to develop, and obviously science is definitely at the heart of that, but we need to modernise that system entirely. So really looking forward to the questions. I think it's great to hear the support in the room, and let's hope that we are able to implement some of that.
Thank you very much, Rain. Thank you, all our panellists, some excellent ideas and insights. I'd like to now throw it open and see if anybody would like to ask a question. If you could just, all right, I've got 3 over this side. If you could just give your name, and if you want to give me the organisation you're from, that's great. And then ask your question, please. I'll just come, lady in the second row here.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Ali from the Wellcome Trust. There's been a few comments about maybe politicians not having the background in science, or maybe the public not necessarily understanding science. So my question is, do we need to make the case to this new government? So obviously it's the same party, but do we as a science community need to be thinking about how do we sell this in again to a new government, or is that backing already there and we've got that support? I'm just interested in the different perceptions, please.
Thank you. I think I'm going to come to you first for that, George. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, it's like anything in politics. This isn't. I think one of the problems with science policy is scientists being rational, evidence-based, and detailed people who reach a conclusion think that once a conclusion's reached, it's obvious. But in politics, everything is contested all of the time. That which you thought you'd agreed, we've got to constantly make the case. I'm afraid you could argue we shouldn't have to, but that's why I'm here. I frankly, I was quite tempted to go and walk in the Dales. But in the end, politics is contested space, and I want this party to continue to make the case, yes, for growth, but the right sort of growth. And yes, tax cuts, but the right sort of tax cuts. And I'm afraid all of us who get this agenda are going to have to redouble the efforts, forget last year's comprehensive spending review happened, and remake the argument, because otherwise, a cabinet looking for 40 billion of cuts to reassure the public markets that is not borrowing and spending too much will go for the easy things that the public won't care about. And time again, what you tend to see happen is that the science budget gets cut. And if the 10 billion earmarked for Horizon is cut, it will be a disaster. I mean, do plan A or do plan B, but for goodness sake, do something. The worst thing would be to spend a year in court and say, oh, well, it's all very complicated, we don't need the money. No, we need to make stuff happen, launch global collaborations quickly. So the answer is yes, we all have to make the case.
Thanks very much, George. Great answer. Lady in the front.
Rosa Wilkinson from the High Value Manufacturing
Hi,
Catapult.
Rosa.
Hi, Margot. And by the way, George, walking in the Dales, as a proud Yorkshire woman, that should always be high on everybody's agenda. One of the things that strikes me is that very often our funding models throw organisations that should be collaborating into competition. I wonder whether what we need is a new approach to funding innovation that really helps drive that triple helix of bringing universities, businesses and government, whether it's national or local, together to focus on particular objectives.
That's a very good question. I'm glad I'm not answering it. Yes, Mike, why don't you go for it?
You're sort of talking about my lived experience there, because if you have, and I know we have the guy who set up Office of Life Science here, okay, but we have, in some cases you might have the Office of Life Science, you might have Department of Health, you might have NHS Innovation, all working and pushing around the same areas and working on the same things. It does need a bit of a radical rethink. Probably the Office of Life Science should lose a word in the aims of reducing bureaucracy and get rid of the word life and have Office of Science as well. But we do need some fundamental changes, because there's a lot of friction between some of the research that's going on and then the adaptation within the NHS. And there's barriers which need to be torn down if we're going to do things more effectively.
Thank you, Mike. Ben, would you like to comment?
I completely agree. I think as somebody who often gets involved in trying to coordinate big, large-scale bids and so on, often
Wasted money.
it's very aggravating when you see something that would be ideal to bring in the expertise in data analysis from here and couple it with the manufacturing expertise over there, and you're not allowed to do that. So I completely agree, and I think that often we have a funding model that focuses on a competition between regions within the UK, and I would like to see us be more cognizant of the fact that actually we want to compete on a global stage. If we're going to be a world leader by 20, I think we already are, but to be right up there in the big leagues, we need to be competing on a global stage, and that means not pitting Manchester versus Leeds versus Bristol versus Birmingham, and allowing those to come together and do something on a scale that actually has global impact.
George?
Yes, I think our research and innovation funding model is broken. I think it needs pretty wholesale reform. From the top, I'll give you 4 points. I mean, at the top, the doctrine is all wrong. I say this having just come out of government. Boris, it might be rightly, I'm a Heseltinian rather than a Lawsonian, if that's the choice, embraced that kind of interventionist economics and politics, let's make stuff happen, back British, drive growth. That is not the doctrine in Whitehall. Whitehall is still working to the cassette, the software cassette from the late 80s, which says we don't do industrial strategy, we only invest in market failure, we don't back winners, we explicitly don't back winners, and funding is in short little cycles subject to Treasury value for money assessment. So it's no wonder if you only back failure in dribbles of little money, you're going to end up with dribbles of little failure. I mean, so there's a huge doctrine point, and I was trying to persuade Boris to reset that and recognise civil servants need a clear instruction. We are now embracing technology strategy, industrial strategy for tomorrow's technologies. Secondly, the value for money assessments of the Treasury. I mean, they're not about value for money. They're about Treasury micromanagement and control of every single decision, just reminding every department you can't do anything without our permission. And the value assessments are not about value, they're about cost. I mean, value, if you want to do, you know, the value of tackling obesity in the West Midlands, which the Treasury say costs $4 billion a year, that would be a value for money assessment. You know, what actually is delivering real value? We should be funding outcomes. I mean, if you want to do innovation, this is what we were trying to get to through the NSTC missions, like the Harrison longitude clock, you'd say we really need a industrial scale fusion reactor that could power a whole city. The first person who can come up with a design for one here's 5 million quid. If you could then put together a consortium, but you just gate the money around the innovations that you want. The market will react, people will flood in, and the incentives are all wrong. We're incentivising people to put in successful bids for little pots of money. We're not incentivising people to solve a problem. So, of course, the funding system is really broken, and I just don't think we're going to become an innovation nation, dibbling little bits of money through Treasury-controlled VFM silos. It's not going to work. It's extraordinary that we've achieved everything we have in that system.
Can I
Yes, do
just
you
add
want to
one
and then we must move on.
Sorry, just one more add on that was we don't value failure. Most people who have successful startups, their first one, and possibly the second, possibly the third, didn't go very well, but they learn a lot along the way, and then it's the third and fourth and so on that then grow and provides that ultimate value. But we don't allow people to have space to fail in that model, and I think that's something that I have no idea how you would change that on policy level, but
Thank you, and thank you, Rosa, for the excellent question. There was somebody with their hand up earlier. Well, the gentleman who's very keen, the fourth row back. Why don't you come to you? And then I've got a gentleman at the back there, and then I'll come to back over there again. Go for it.
Thank you. So, in probably the nerdiest question of the day, I'm Joe from the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. Recently, the ONS changed how they classify the business R&D contribution to the economy, which is pretty major because they found an additional over 20 billion of investment coming from the business sector. The consequence of which mean, I believe, we hit 2.4% back in 2019. So, positive news. My concern is, what does that mean for the uplifts in the R&D budget that George managed to secure in the comprehensive spending review, and will government regard it as job done, let's cut and stick where we are when we're still lagging behind other international competitors?
Joe, that's a really great question for George.
It's a great question. So that work actually came out of me like a dog with a bone, insisting that if 2.4% means something, it should in government, we now need to map, we're putting in 30 billion extra public, what is the private industry match? And back of the fact packet, it seemed to me that it was roughly about 100 billion over the 5 years. Even within 2 or 3 meetings in base, people say, hang on a minute, that doesn't include what can we get some base numbers so we actually know? And it's that piece of work that has led to us discovering, guess what? We're already at 2.4%. Huge risk that the Cabinet says, oh, well, we've already achieved our 27 target by now. That wasn't the point of the 2.4%. It was to set a galvanising stretch target to signal that we're becoming more of an R&D economy. So if it is now, well, first thing, we need to agree the metrics and the data and stick to them. If it is now we're at 2.5%, hallelujah, now we've got to get on into the third quartile. We've got to get to 3%. Israel's at 3.8, I think, so Switzerland's at 3.6, Finland's at 4. So set a new target, don't drop the mission, because the mission is to become more of an R&D economy.
Thanks. Thanks for your question, Joe. Gentleman at the back here.
Hi, I'm Victor Aguali. I'm doing something with Midlands Health, and I wasn't going to say anything, and then George said something that reminded me of my personal experience. I'm the co-founder of a business called Visionable, digital innovation. We've got 27 patents, we own them all. It's a British company. The patents alone are worth over 16 million. And you described the invention of fusion, and I thought, actually, you know what happened? The person doing that invention would invent it, possibly, if they were lucky enough and they got through the rigmarole of government finance with government funding, and then they'd go to America. Because I can tell you now, my experience is that actually in this country, not only are we risk averse, but you see innovation literally created in front of your eyes in this country, and because we are so risk averse, and because we have a policy which actually mitigates against the spread of innovation in this country, they go to America. And it's not just my business, I'm speaking personally here from my experience, actual experience. There are lots of others.
Thank you. That's a very painful issue you've raised.
Bizarre.
Yeah, no, it's. I totally agree with what you've said. It is a problem for our economy. Rain, would you like to come in on this?
Look, I think, and more broadly, maybe picking up on some of the other questions, as well. I mean, I agree with what George and others have said. Now is a critical time for us to make the case for science, for R&D spend. ONS is continually revising how they measure things. But I think what we do know is that the UK's overall productivity numbers haven't changed. So we need to still be driving the innovation to improve growth. And we absolutely have to remember that this is a competitive game as well. And if we sort of stand back and are not, sort of leading the pack, then some of the science and innovation will go elsewhere. So it is absolutely around science being essential to that, but also the wider tax landscape being one that encourages investment here in the UK. That's undoubtedly the case. And I think, and I know George talked as well about how the sort of Treasury, we need to make the case within the Treasury as well. I think they do understand, but I think one of the things that we need to get better at is measuring that wider sense of what outcomes matter. It isn't just about the overall narrow GDP or economic outcomes. So we need to think about health, we need to think about air quality, we need to think about those wider things where prevention is so much better than trying to deal with people out, once they are, presenting in the hospital. And I think if we had a better assessment around some of the co-benefits of the move to a net zero economy and also what it does for our health and well-being, we'd be making better decisions about where we, spend our public resources.
Mike, thank you very much, Rain. Mike, you're at the sharp end of some of all this, and I was interested in what you said about spin-outs in your speech as well from universities, which is a bit of a bugbear of mine at the moment. So, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think probably what you're talking about is, it sort of goes back to the access to capital thing. I've floated a business on NYSE before in my career, and we worked out we could get 6 times the amount of money by floating it in the US than we could in the UK, because there's access to capital. Okay, so that's a problem. How do you solve that? Well, one of the economic changes in this country has been Brexit. It gives us a freedom to change some of the rules as we see fit. Rules around pensions and how they look after funds. Rules around the Basel work on banks as well. We've got to get more capital into the system. We've also got to get more capital into science in the system. If you look at the FTSE, 3 out of the FTSE top 10 are pharma, biotech companies. But then there's only another 5 in the next 90. It's a very thin environment. We have more insurance companies in the FTSE 100 than we do life science and technology companies. We've got to get better at providing access to capital, and we have to put some structures in place. And Rain's probably a better tax expert than I am, but we have to get more capital into the system to stop companies leaving. Companies like DeepMind.
Yes, DeepMind. That was treasure. George.
Completely agree. I think there's 2 bits to it. There's a volume of capital piece. NASDAQ is easy, you can raise a lot of money there. We started, and again I hope this continues, to make an important move when Rishi was Chancellor and I and Number 10 working on, and John Glenn, City Minister, to make a big move to basically copy the French, who are making some pretty big advances. They launched the Tibby scheme. It's unlocked huge amounts of French pension investment money into sci-tech. We could do the same. Brexit freedoms absolutely mean we could. We need to, fast. Fast is the key. I mean, we need to sort of get this all done by the spring so that next year our city investors can start to look. There's a pipeline of companies coming through now. The other thing is also adoption. I used to run high-risk technology companies, and it's all about early adoption into the market. You don't need to sell to everyone, but you need to sell to someone. You need to find a first buyer. That's quite tough in the UK because our public sector is very badly geared to adopt innovation, back to Treasury rules. Whereas in the US, you can normally find a first buyer. And the first buyer is a validating moment, and that drives you into success, which is why I'm so passionate about the UK as a technology test bed. We need to create an autonomous vehicle test bed, a satellite manufacturing test. Not everywhere, but test beds where you come to Britain because you can get your thing proven to work in the NHS, proven to work in Formula One, proven to work in the City of London, and you'll then raise money off the data. So we should digitalise our regulatory test beds, because we've got to win back some edge over big markets.
I'm going to bring Rosa into this in a minute, but do you want to just make a small comment on that?
A quick comment on that. In a past life, I was Director of Innovation at the Intellectual Property Office, and I spoke to business after business, picking up on George's point there about adoption. that was frustrated. They got a patent for their particular idea, often in healthcare, and then were not able to get buyers that would mean that they could go on to get the finance that they needed to take their business to the next level. And that was in part because there was a disconnect between what they were doing, the regulatory framework, and procurement mechanisms within the NHS. We need to get all of those things working together so that it actually drives the growth of those companies and anchors them here within the UK. I think the other thing that then does is it breeds a capital investment market here within the UK that will see there are opportunities, and they will drop onto those companies and give them the finance that they need. As you say, George, it's not just about capital volumes. There's a dating agency element in there as well.
Thank you for bringing that up. There was a lady, fourth row. Yes, please.
Just going back to a point you made about the background of people. I trained, I'm a retired teacher, I trained in geography. I didn't really like it. I specialised in maths. And I live in Dorset. And I didn't like teaching it, and then I went on to teach PE and games as well, and I've trained some world-class athletes as well. I'm useless at games and PE. But when I also, as a chair of a local Conservative association, and I hope I don't have to do it, try and put into place and select someone to become our MP, we don't really look and see if they've got a science degree. We're looking for the best person who's got the most passion about where they want to stand for their area, and if they've got legs and can deliver a lot of leaflets, to be honest. But it's that passion that people have got, and I don't think you can really say, oh, they didn't, this is not their degree. And just as a by side, I'll go on to something else in a minute, look at the Red Arrows display team and have a look at the degrees they've got, and you'll find a couple have got history and classics. So there's that. So try it. I'm from Bournemouth. We've got the problem we had at Bournemouth University, and my husband teaches there, and we wanted to create a new technology hub for IT and what have you. The problem was actually persuading the public to let this space be developed on what it was going to be. They were so wary of it, it was just ridiculous. They couldn't see it as this was going, I don't know what they thought it was going to cause a problem. And so I think there's a case there at trying to persuade the public when you develop your clusters, what it's going to bring to the area as well, and what's your thoughts on that?
Thank you. I think that's a question directed at you, Mike.
I wasn't saying you have to have a science degree. I'm saying that you've got a piece of work to do. If your MP, councillor, or whatever doesn't have a science degree, you have another piece of work to educate them. I remember doing the House of Lords Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and I spent 55 minutes telling them what artificial intelligence was before we actually talked about what it meant. So you've got an education job to do. I agree. You've got to pick somebody who's good for your area, because that's what an MP does. But you have to recognise if they don't understand science and scientific principles and how things work, you've got more work to do to get them to understand it. And it's true, Science and Technology Committee, 4 times as many people have got law degrees have got physics degrees. So that just tells me there's a pile of work to do.
Physics is hard.
There's 4 times as many as biology as well. So just so you know.
Ray, did you want to say something there?
I guess just to add, I think I don't think you need a science degree to understand that science is important to our economy, and I think that's where just people being aware of the importance, the role it plays, of the fact that we do have world-leading universities developing the most amazing scientific research around the UK. So I think we do have to be careful to say that not if you don't have a science degree you can't appreciate it. I think it is broader than that, though. For us to compete in that global market, we've got to be producing some of the best students and the best capabilities. And I guess by one insight, I think one of the things that frustrates, maybe I say this with some passion as a daughter, one of my daughters is just starting to choose her GCSEs, is I do think there is a challenge in the country about how we narrow down people in their choices they have to make, and then what they go on to study. I think being able at the age, having to decide at the age of 14 what's important to you and what you want to be, I think is really, and it does mean that too many young people leave behind maths because they're not confident they're going to get top marks in maths, but it's so critical for any kind of, so many different kinds of skills that we need in so many different kinds of jobs. So I think having which gives people more freedom and also to change their minds, right? I think there is something about our education system to just give people more breadth so they can take a science and not necessarily get an A star in science, but still go on to do a great, and I think we don't allow our young people to take those kind of risks, and I think that is a problem.
Thanks, Rain. I'm going to take one more question from this gentleman here, and then I'm going to ask the panellists if they've got anything burning that they want to share just before we close. Gentleman at the front here. Sorry to other people who have their hands up. I do apologise, but I'm just mindful of time. We need to finish at 1:15.
Cool. Thank you, Margot. It relates to George's cluster mapping work. We have got a few years to reflect on the science and innovation audits from a few years ago. I was just wondering whether the panel had any reflections on how helpful they had been in catalysing innovation or any lessons learned.
Well, that's a nice general question, and I will ask the panel to comment on your question and bring in their one point that they might want to bring in at the same time. I'm going to start this end of the table and work across. Mike.
I'm a life science guy, I don't see all the other stuff, and believe me, I just keep focused on that, and I just look at the life science outputs and metrics on that. So probably not best person to comment on it.
Did you want to say anything else before we close? Or,
No.
well, I'll come back to you if you like,
Okay.
Mike. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I'm probably not the best person to answer that question in specific. I guess in that sort of more general thing, for me, I just want to make sure that we keep that focus on science and innovation in our wider growth strategy, and that it matters not just, we develop clusters around the UK to really help drive the growth we need to see.
Thank you. George.
2 points. I think we really need some properly audited standard annual 2-yearly metrics around where we're really good, where we've got real strength. Politicians assert very often we're world class in everything. I've spent half the last year warning people, we are falling behind in life sciences. Global competition is overtaking us. We're not a world leader in fusion. We could be. We're not a world leader. We need to cut the bollocks that we're world class at everything. Some proper evidence-based research on where we really are a powerhouse internationally would be a really good start. And it would bring a bit of honesty into a debate that, if you're not careful, can become boosterism without any basis. And the second bit of it is that I think in order to tell ourselves a new story as a country about what we're really good at and what the world really wants from us and the opportunities, and to get clusters, which is what the topic of this session was, excited, I think some audits around regional clusters, just mapping them very simply. The Northeast, if you're from the Northeast, you think it's a deindustrialised, blue-collar tumbleweed. Wrong, wrong, wrong. The Northeast is leading in this, leading in that, home to 400 high-growth companies, creating over the next 5 years 10,000 jobs here. Just an audit by region, so that no teacher in a location is unaware that this region is creating exciting jobs. A lot of my teachers in Norfolk have no idea what's going on at the Norwich Research Park, what's going on in East Anglia. So audits at 2 levels, for honesty about the national debate. And by the way, we're falling behind quite fast in quite a number of key areas. And there is no way at the moment of anyone in Cabinet seeing it, unless Patrick Balance or I point it out. And locally, we need to tell a story so people are excited.
Great. Thanks, George. Ben.
I'm sort of reflecting on my answer. To go back to the original question about the SIAs, so we were involved in one of the SIAs in life sciences in the north, and I think that piece of work was very useful in identifying some of those key pocket areas of strength. So we looked at, for example, precision medicine, advanced therapies, data, things like that. And those areas have grown into programs that the NHSA runs and have fed into various different bits across sort of policy and projects and things that have been awarded. So I think they were useful and of their time. But I also think that audits are sort of by necessity out of date almost by the time you finish writing them, particularly on something that big where we cover such a broad area. So I think, to pick up on George's point, I think having a few key core metrics and audits on and looking at a particular geographical clusters is a really good idea. I think the narrative telling and the feedback loop and speeding up that feedback loop between central and local government and the and the skills system and industry. I think that's where cluster development organisations like ours can play a role. I would say that obviously, but if you want to know what's going on in advanced therapies across the north of England, I've got 100 people that meet every quarter and talk about that and talk about what the challenges are. And to George's point, I come from, I live in Sheffield. Everyone thinks of Sheffield as manufacturing, but we've got a lot of biotech happening actually, and we've got advanced therapies, cell and gene therapy manufacturing site coming online soon. So those old narratives kind of need to go away a little. There is really good manufacturing in Sheffield, but some of those old narratives need to go away a bit, and I think the qualitative side can also play a role in that.
Thank you. And I would like to come back to you, Mike, in case you want to make one final point.
Final point is we're pleased this morning to host Prime Minister and Chancellor at our brand new Life Science Park in Birmingham, able to get some messages across about how important science is going to be, how important life science is going to be, working with people like Midlands Innovation Health, working with our NHS partners as well. It's critical. We just have to be like water on a stone about science, and we have to educate as many people as possible to get the investment.
Thanks very much, Mike, and I think your points, all the panellists, I think are all very much focused on making sure the links work between science, R&D, innovation, and I would add, coming from WMG, the final step in that loop is manufacturing, because it creates thousands of jobs, and the point is to use the R&D, the innovation and the science to make sure that in the future those jobs are better jobs for our communities. So thank you all very much for coming. Thanks to our panellists. Clap to our panellists.